Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Hadith 302. This is about what is recited between the Takbiratul Ihram and the Fatiha. From Abu Hurairah, he says that when the Prophet would make the takbir for the Salah, he would remain quiet for a little while before he would recite the Fatiha. And so I asked the Prophet, O Messenger of Allah, may my mother and father be sacrificed for you. Inform me about this silence of yours between the takbir and the Fatiha. What do you say? And the Prophet replies that I say, Allahumma ba'id bayni wa bayna khatayaya kama ba'adta bayna al-mashriqi wal-maghrib. O Allah, remove me from my sins, just as the east is removed from the west. Allahumma naqqini min khatayaya kama yunaqqa thawb al-abyadu min ad-danas. O Allah, cleanse me of my sins, just like the white clothing is cleansed from the dirt. Allahumma ghsilni min khatayaya bil-thalji wal-ma'i wal-barad. O Allah, cleanse me from my sins with ice, water and hailstone. And so with this hadith we learn the dua al-istiftah, the opening dua in the Salah. And for the dua al-istiftah there are differing narrations and differing wordings. So any of that which is authentic can be said, but they must not be combined, so it's either one or the other. However, this is without doubt an authentic narration. Of course, you know it's in Muslim. And so we find that this dua ought to be said. It is mustahab, or recommended to be said, because the Prophet did it, but he never verbally ordered it to be done. So therefore it is recommended. We find here the Prophet says to cleanse him of his sins with ice, water and hailstone. These are cold substances. And the reason why cold substances are used here, because normally it is warm water which is more effective at cleaning the dirt. Well, the ulama say it's because the sins have a heat about them, because sins lead to the fire of Jahannam, which has a heat. And so the cold substances are mentioned because it opposes the heat of the sins. We can also take that you don't just remain silent in the prayer, rather the prayer is about actions and recitation. So there shouldn't be a point in the Salah in which you are just remaining silent. And so this is why Abu Hurairah asked the Prophet, what are you reciting during your silence? Because it was well understood that you don't remain silent in the prayer. Also we take the valuable lesson that Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh was eager to seek knowledge, and he would eagerly observe the prayer of the Prophet as well, such that he even noticed his silence. It should also be noted that before the recitation of any part of the Quran instructs us to say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Now the question is, should this be said in every rak'ah before you recite the Fatiha? Well, the answer is that the safest way is to recite it every rak'ah, because every rak'ah is an independent recitation, meaning independent to the previous rak'ah. Hadith 303. It is the statement of Anas. He says a man came into the Salat al-Jama'ah and he was panting, and he said out aloud, Alhamdulillahi hamdan kathiran tayyiban mubarakan fi. And at the end of the Salah, the Prophet asked, who said this? And nobody replied. And then the Prophet asked again, who said this? Because he did not say anything bad. And then the man said that I said this, O Messenger of Allah. And the Prophet replied, لَقَدْ رَأَيْتُ 12 مَلَكًا يَبْتَدِرُونَ بِهَا أَيُّهُمْ يَرْفَعُهَا. I saw 12 angels racing each other, which one of them could raise these words up, meaning up to the heavens and to bring it up to Allah Jalla wa Ala, to whom all good deeds are raised. So we learn then from this narration that this is a dhikr which can be said in the Salah along with the dua al-istiftah, and this is a sunnah taqririyah, a sunnah which the Prophet has acknowledged. So it cannot be said that this is a bid'ah. So if the Prophet acknowledges something which was done during his time, then this becomes a sunnah taqririyah. For example, Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu anh performing the 2 rak'ah salah after making wudu. This is the sunnah taqririyah as well. We have another narration in the same chapter, narrated from Ibn Umar. He says, whilst we were praying with the Prophet, a man said in the Salah, Allahu Akbaru kabira, walhamdulillahi kathira, wa subhanallahi bukratan wa asila. And at the end the Prophet asked, who is the one who said this? The man replied, it was I. And the Prophet replied, Ajibtu laha futihat laha abwabus sama. I wondered at this dhikr. The gates of the heavens were opened for it. And Ibn Umar says that after I heard the Prophet say that, I always made this dhikr. So this appears to be yet another scenario, not the same one as the previous one, and we find both of these are adhkar which the Prophet acknowledged. Hence they become sunnah taqreeriyah. And in this book, Sahih Muslim, Imam Muslim puts it under the title, what is said between the Takbiratul Ihram and the Fatiha. So it appears to us that both of these adhkar which we have heard, to which the Prophet acknowledged, are to be said as part of the Dua al-Istiftah, so between the Takbiratul Ihram and the Al-Fatiha. This is what is apparent by the title given by Imam Muslim.
We may also learn something about the unseen, which is that the Malaika raise up your deeds, and also that the gates of the sky are opened up for the deeds. And all of this, of course, we cannot see.
Hadith 304, about coming to the Salah with sakina and tranquility, from Abu Hurairah. The Prophet said, إِذَا ثُوِّبَ لِلصَّلَاةِ فَلَا تَأْتُوهَا وَأَنْتُمْ تَسْعُونَ وَأْتُوهَا وَعَلَيْكُمُ السَّكِينَةُ فَمَا أَدْرَكْتُمْ فَصَلُّوا وَمَا فَاتَكُمْ فَأْتِمُّوا فَإِنَّ أَحَدَكُمْ إِذَا كَانَ يَعْمِدُ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَهُوَ فِي صَلَاةٍ. He says, when the iqamah is given, then you should come to the prayer, and there is complete tranquility upon you, and you must not be hurrying. Whatever you catch, you pray, and whatever you miss from the salah, you complete it. For one of you, when he is coming to the salah, he is in fact in a state of the salah. We find from this narration then that the iqamah, certainly in those days, would be heard from outside the masjid, and this is when the people would start walking to the masjid. These are of course the people who are not already in the masjid. Otherwise we know there is a great virtue in sitting in the masjid waiting for the next prayer. The iqamah is a fard kifaya upon the men, and it would be heard in those days from outside the masjid. Of course, in many countries it is still heard from outside the masjid, and in some other non-Muslim countries it is not heard from outside the masjid, neither is the normal adhan. The Prophet is telling us you don't run to the masjid when you hear the iqamah. Rather, you should walk with tranquility. And he justifies this by saying that when one of you is coming to the prayer, then he is in a state of prayer. Now in a state of prayer, you don't rush your movements along, do you? The prayer is a time for tranquility, of course. So when you are walking to the prayer, you are in fact in a state of prayer. Therefore, you need to observe the etiquettes and not rush, because in the prayer, you do not rush yourself. The Prophet says, whatever you catch, then you pray, and whatever you missed, you complete it. Now, the completion can only come after the first part. So if that is understood, then it means that if the Imam is, let's say, in his second rak'ah, and you join him, then your first rak'ah would be the Imam's second rak'ah. And you do not say that you'll make this your second rak'ah, and then after the Imam finishes, you will catch up on your first rak'ah. No, rather, your first rak'ah would be the Imam's second rak'ah. Then when the Imam finishes the prayer, you will have one more rak'ah left, and this would be your fourth rak'ah. And this is what is apparent from the hadith, because the Prophet says, وَمَا فَاتَكُمْ فَأَتِمُّوا. Whatever missed you, then you complete it. So the completion can only come after the first part. And even rationally, this makes more sense, because how can you be praying the second rak'ah before the first rak'ah? Of course, you have to go in order. Sure, your intention then would be different to the Imam's. The Imam has the intention of the second and you have the intention of the first, but it is well known that the difference of intention does not matter when you're praying behind the Imam. You could even be intending a different prayer altogether, and even that would be permissible.
Now here most scholars say that even if you catch a part of the Salah with the Imam, you have caught the Salah and you make up whatever you missed out, because the hadith says, فَمَا أَدْرَكْتُمْ فَصَلُّوا. Whatever you catch, then pray it. So it is general, whatever amount you catch. And this is the majority opinion. There is another opinion which says that you've only caught the Salatul Jama'ah if you catch a full rak'ah with the Imam. And that would be counted as catching the Imam in the ruku' position. If you caught him after the ruku' position, you have not caught that particular rak'ah with the Imam. And the evidence for that is the narration of Abu Bakr. However, it should be noted that this would not apply to the Salatul Jum'ah. You have to catch one rak'ah of the Jum'ah in order to catch the Salatul Jum'ah. So if you caught less than one rak'ah of Salatul Jum'ah, let's say you caught the Imam after the ruku' in the second rak'ah, then in this case you have not caught the Jama'ah, and you would have to make it up as al-Dhuhr. Also, the generality of this narration teaches us that you enter the Salah in whatever the position the Imam is in, even if the Imam is in the sajda. And that you do not say, oh well, I've missed this rak'ah, so let me wait for the Imam to get up for the next rak'ah. No, that is wrong, because every sajda carries a reward. It raises you in Jannah and expiates a sin. So why would you not want to make use of this opportunity? And also, it should be noted that this hadith abrogates a previous practice of the Sahaba who would pray whatever they missed by themselves and then join the Imam. But that no longer needs to be done.
Hadith 305 from Abu Qatada, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةُ فَلَا تَقُومُوا حَتَّى تَرَوْنِي. When the iqamah is given, then do not get up until you see me. And this makes sense because the ma'moom follows the imam. So the ma'moom should not get up before the imam has got up for the prayer or has entered into the masjid for the prayer. What happens if the imam enters the masjid before the iqamah is given? Can you stand up? The answer here is yes, you can stand up even before the iqamah is given. So the important point is not the iqamah, rather the important point is when the imam enters the masjid ready for the prayer. Then when you see him, you stand up, even if the iqamah has not been given. But if the iqamah is given and you don't see the imam, then it is better not to stand up. Hadith 306 from Abu Hurairah, he narrates that the iqamah was given for the salah, and we got up and we straightened out the rows before the Prophet got out of his home and came to us. Then the Prophet came and he stood to lead the prayer. Then before he made the takbir, he remembered something and he went away. And he said to the people, Makanakum, stay in your places. And so they remained waiting until the Prophet returned, and he had made ghusl, or taken a bath, and his hair was dripping with water. And then he made the takbir and prayed. Here we find in the narration that the companions got up and they straightened the rows before the Prophet entered the masjid. So this would then tell us that the verbal order given by the Prophet in the previous hadith, إِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةُ فَلَا تَقُومُوا حَتَّى تَرَوْنِي, that you only stand up when you see the Imam, this is a recommendation, not an obligation. Also we take from the narration that you straighten the rows because the companions, they made ta'adil, or they straightened the rows up and made it nice and proper. Many Muslims forget or overlook this obligation of straightening the rows. And the Prophet has ordered us, he said, عِبَادَ اللَّهِ لَتُسَوُّنَّ صُفُوفَكُمْ أَوْ لَا يُخَالِفَنَّ اللَّهُ بَيْنَ وُجُوهِكُمْ. You will surely straighten the rows, or Allah will sow discord between you. So your hearts would differ, and your opinions would differ, and you would be in disagreement over each other in most affairs. We can also take from the hadith that the Prophet is a human being and he forgets, because here he forgot to take a bath. So as for straightening the rows, then if you did not straighten the rows, we don't say your prayer is invalid, rather the prayer is valid, but you are sinful for not straightening the rows. Because the straightening of the rows is not wajib in the prayer, it is wajib for the prayer. As for if you did not do something which is wajib in the prayer deliberately, then this would nullify your prayer. The Zahiriyya would say that not straightening the row means you have disobeyed the Prophet in something which is pertaining to the prayer, hence it nullifies the prayer. It's a similar thing with the Prophet forbidding you from raising your sights up to the skies during the prayer. The Prophet warned us that these people should stop doing this, otherwise their eyesight would be taken away. The Zahiriyya would say that if you did raise your vision up to the sky, your prayer is nullified. And most scholars say no, your prayer is still valid, but you are sinful, because raising your sights up to the sky during the prayer is bad etiquette in the prayer. And when you stand in front of Allah Jalla wa Ala in the Salah, then you need to be lowly and humble, not raising your head to the sky. Similarly, when it comes to reciting the Quran in the ruku' and the sajda, the Zahiriyya would say that it breaks your prayer because of the specific prohibition given. And most scholars say no, it doesn't break the prayer, it is simply bad etiquette in the prayer, because the ruku' and the sujood are lowly positions, and in these lowly positions it is not fitting that the most noble of speech, the Quran, should be recited. Hadith 307 from Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, Man adraka rak'atan min as-salah faqad adraka as-salah. Whoever catches one rak'ah of the salah, then he has caught the whole salah. And so this hadith has many applications. If you catch one rak'ah of the salah behind the imam, then it is as if you have caught the whole obligatory jama'ah prayer. So for example, if you catch one rak'ah of the Salatul Jumu'ah, then you make up for the other rak'ah. So you pray 2 in total, whereas if you caught less than 1 rak'ah behind the Imam for the Salatul Jumu'ah, then you make it up as the Salatul Dhuhr, because you have not caught the whole Jama'ah, because it does not hold true that you caught the Salah. So if you make up for 1 more rak'ah, then what use would that be? It doesn't hold true that you've caught the Salatul Jumu'ah, and the Salatul Dhuhr is never prayed with 2 rak'at normally when you are resident. What about a menstruating woman? If she's menstruating, we know that she does not pray, but what about when she finishes her menses at Asr time before the sun sets, and there's enough time for her to pray 1 rak'ah at least of Salat al-Asr? Does she need to pray Salat al-Asr? We say yes, because she has caught the Salat al-Asr in its proper time, because she's caught enough of the time to catch 1 rak'ah. As for if she does not have enough time even for 1 rak'ah when she is purified from the menses, then we say she has not caught the Salat al-Asr, even if the sun has not set yet. In another narration in the same chapter, the Prophet said, "Man adraka rak'atan min as-subhi qabla an tatlu'a ash-shamsu faqad adraka as-subh, wa man adraka rak'atan min al-'asr qabla an taghruba ash-shamsu faqad adraka al-'asr." Whoever catches 1 rak'ah of Salat al-Subh before the sun rises, then he has caught the Salat al-Subh, and whoever catches 1 rak'ah of Asr before the sun sets, then he has caught Salat al-Asr in its proper time. So this, with the Salat al-Asr, would be in a case of necessity. We know that the Salat al-Asr begins when the shadow of a man is at its same length, and it ends when the sun turns yellow. But after that, the time of necessity would be from the yellowness of the sun till when the sun sets. So if you can catch 1 rak'ah of Asr before the sun sets, then you have caught Salat al-Asr. Otherwise, you have missed its time. If a woman comes upon this time of the Salat al-Asr, let's say, and she delays the Salat al-Asr and wants to pray it later, but then her menses start, then after 6-7 days, when her menses end, does she have to make up for this Salat al-Asr? The answer here is no, because she delayed the Salat al-Asr and she was well within her rights to delay Salat al-Asr. But if she delayed the prayer to a time where there is less than 1 rak'ah of that prayer available for her to pray, then here she is blameworthy, because she deliberately missed the timing of the prayer, and she had no right to do so. So you have the right to delay the prayer, but you don't have the right to delay the prayer so much so that there is less than 1 rak'ah of that prayer left, even before the next prayer time enters. So if her menses came at this time, when there is less than 1 rak'ah of that prayer available, then here when her menses finish, she would have to make up for that prayer, because in this case now she was in the wrong, whereas in the previous case she was not in the wrong because she had the right to delay. Hadith 308, we talk about the timing of the prayer. From Abdullah ibn Amr, the Prophet said, وَقْتُ الظُّهْرِ إِذَا زَالَتِ الشَّمْسُ وَكَانَ ظِلُّ الرَّجُلِ كَطُولِهِ. The time of Dhuhr is when the sun declines and the shadow of a man is the same length as his height. مَا لَمْ يَحْضُرِ الْعَصْرِ, as long as the Asr does not enter. وَوَقْتُ الْعَصْرِ مَا لَمْ تَصْفَرَّ الشَّمْسِ, and the time of Asr is up until the sun becoming yellow. وَوَقْتُ صَلَاةِ الْمَغْرِبِ مَا لَمْ يَغِبِ الشَّفَقِ, and the Maghrib is until the twilight disappears, which is the redness in the sky. وَوَقْتُ صَلَاةِ الْعِشَاءِ إِلَى نِصْفِ اللَّيْلِ الْأَوْسَطِ, and the Isha prayer is up until the half of the night. وَوَقْتُ صَلَاةِ الصُّبْحِ مِنْ طُلُوعِ الْفَجْرِ مَا لَمْ تَطْلُعِ الشَّمْسِ, and the Salat al-Subh is when the dawn breaks up until the sunrise. فَإِذَا طَلَعَتِ الشَّمْسُ فَأَمْسِكْ عَنِ الصَّلَاةِ فَإِنَّهَا تَطْلُعُ بَيْنَ قَرْنَيْ الشَّيْطَانِ. So when the sun begins to rise, then you must refrain from the prayer, because the sun rises between the 2 horns of shaitan. So this hadith is extremely comprehensive in telling us when the prayer time begins and ends. The Dhuhr time begins when the sun declines from the zenith, that's clear enough, but then the hadith goes on to say, and the shadow of a man is the same length as his height. So this then has to be when the Dhuhr ends, and at that time the Asr would begin, and the Asr would be from the shadow being the same length as the man up until the sun becoming yellow. Other narrations tell us when the shadow of a man is twice his height. And this narration tells us when the sun becomes yellow. Now the sun becoming yellow happens after the shadow of a man is twice his length. So therefore we can take this narration over the other one because this narration gives us more information, meaning it lengthens out the Salat al-Asr time more. So this is more worthy to be taken because it's giving us more information. As for the time between the sun becoming yellow and the sun setting, then this is the waqt al-darura. You're only allowed to delay the Salat al-Asr in a case of necessity, but not if you just want to perform it later on for no particular reason. No, you're not allowed to do that. So Salat al-Asr is in fact a unique prayer because it has a normal time of praying and a necessity time of praying. The other prayers do not. Then Maghrib is when the sun sets, as the name indicates, so that's why it's not specifically and explicitly stated in the hadith because the name is self-explanatory, but it does tell us when it ends. It ends when the twilight disappears, that's the redness in the sky. And then the Salat al-Isha begins at that point, because all of these prayers are continuous, and it ends at midnight. So midnight would be the time in between Maghrib and dawnbreak. So it's the middle time in between these two. It of course does not have to be 12 o'clock. Rather we go by the sunset and dawnbreak to determine the midnight. So you need to note here that after midnight the Salat al-Isha ends. So you are not allowed to delay the Salat al-Isha right up until close to the Salat al-Subh. This would be wrong. So all the prayers are joined together, meaning their timing, so it's continuous, except for between Salat al-Isha and Salat al-Subh. Likewise between the Salat al-Subh and the Salat al-Dhuhr. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةَ لِدُلُوكِ الشَّمْسِ إِلَى غَسَقِ اللَّيْلِ وَقُرْآنِ الْفَجْرِ إِنَّ قُرْآنَ الْفَجْرِ كَانَ مَشْهُودًا. Establish the prayer from the time when the sun rubs you, meaning to say when it is at its hottest, so it declines from the zenith, up until the غَسَقِ اللَّيْل, up until the darkness of the night. So this is all continuous. So it's joined on from Dhuhr to Asr to Maghrib to Isha. It's all joined on. Then he says, وَقُرْآنَ الْفَجْرِ, and the recitation of Fajr. So he mentions the Fajr separately. It indicates to us that there's a clear gap between Salat al-Isha and Salat al-Fajr. So as for Salat al-Fajr then, it is at dawnbreak, but the dawnbreak is of two types. One is the false dawn and the other one is the true dawn. The true dawn comes after the false dawn. The false dawn has light going upwards, true dawn has light going across the horizon. The false dawn becomes darker after the initial light. The true dawn continues on to getting brighter. The false dawn has a light which is not connected to the horizon. The true dawn has light connected to the horizon. So these are three differences between the false dawn and the true dawn. With regards to the Salat al-Isha, there is a narration which talks about the time ending at the third of the night. So again, we go with the narration which gives us more information and we say that it ends at half of the night because this is giving us more knowledge. So we take that. Otherwise, we could say that the more recommended time for Salat al-Isha is when the third of the night passes by, because the later you can pray it, the better. Hadith number 309 from Abu Hurairah, that the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا اشْتَدَّ الْحَرُّ فَأَبْرِدُوا عَنِ الصَّلَاةِ فَإِنَّ شِدَّةَ الْحَرِّ مِنْ فَيْحِ جَهَنَّمَ. When it is extremely hot, then delay your Salat al-Dhuhr until it becomes cooler, because the heat is from the breath of Jahannam. We know in the authentic hadith that Jahannam, when it was created, it became so hot that it started to consume its own self. So Allah Jalla wa Ala allowed it to exhale twice, and the Prophet says that this is why you find the coldness in the winter and the heat in the summer, because with two breaths it creates the heat, and so therefore it gives you the extreme heat in the summer. But if it is summer or extremely hot in one place, then it's going to be extremely cold in another. So for example, Britain and Australia, if it is summer in Britain, it will be winter in Australia, and then vice versa. So because of these two breaths, it causes the extreme heat in the summer in one particular place, and this would mean that it creates extreme cold in another place. So the hadith is telling us here that when it is extremely hot, it is not fitting to be praying at that time. Just like, for example, at Zawal time, the Prophet says that the Jahannam is being heated, so it is not fitting to be praying then, so you pray when the sun declines from the zenith. But as for when it is extremely hot, like in the summer times, then you should delay it up until close to the Salat al-Asr time. And so this is an exception to the general rule that you pray at the early time. and that the best time for prayer is the early time. This is an exception to that generality.
Also, take note that this ruling is general. It applies to everyone, whether you're praying in Jama'ah or whether you're praying by yourself, whether you're traveling or whether you're resident. It is general. It should also be noted that the Salah referred to in the hadith is the Salatul Dhuhr or the Salatul Jumu'ah, because it is at that time when you have the intensity of the heat. As for Asr time and beyond, and even before the Dhuhr time, it is cooler. And there are other wordings of this narration which explicitly mention the word al-Dhuhr. And this is the majority opinion. Also, because the Prophet talks about the exhalation of Jahannam, we may conclude that Jahannam exists today, even if there is no one in it as of yet. And this is the view of the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, that Jannah and Jahannam both exist as we speak.
Hadith 310, from Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, اشتكت النار إلى ربها فقالت يا ربي أكل بعضي بعضا فأذن لها بنفسين نفس في الشتاء ونفس في الصيف فهو أشد ما تجدون من الحر وأشد ما تجدون من الزمهرير. The fire complained to its Lord. It says, some parts of me have consumed the other, so Allah allowed it to exhale twice, one in the winter and one in the summer. So this exhalation is the severe heat you find, and it is also the severe cold which you find. And so the explanation behind this is, as we have said, the exhalation produces the heat because, of course, Jahannam is hot, and this produces the extreme heat. But the Prophet says that it is also the extreme cold which you find, but this makes sense because in the other part of the world it will be extremely hot, so you will find it to be cold, just as in the Britain and Australia example that we have. So this hadith does not mean that Jahannam is cold. But the controversy over this hadith would be that this heat and the cold which we find can be explained through scientific means, can it not? So would this then render this hadith to be incorrect because there's a clear contradiction? We say no, there's no contradiction, rather the Muslim will accept both, the scientific explanation and also the unseen explanation which is found in this hadith here. And the reason why it is not a contradiction is because the two directions or the two avenues are different. If you are driving up north and another person is driving down south, then you're driving in opposite directions. The question is, will your cars crash? Well, the answer is no, they will not crash if you are driving in different avenues. So for example, in a different lane. The crash will only happen if you are in the same lane. So for example, you're going the wrong way in a one-way street. So if the avenues are different, we cannot have a contradiction even if the explanations are different. So for example, if you look at a person front on and you say that he is wearing an all blue jumper, and another person comes and looks at that same person front on and he says that he's not wearing an all blue jumper. This is a clear contradiction because either he is wearing an all blue jumper or he's not wearing an all blue jumper. So both statements cannot be correct. However, if you saw this person from the left hand side and you said that he is wearing an all blue jumper, and another person comes along and looks at the same person from the right hand side and he says that he's not wearing an all blue jumper, is this a contradiction? The answer is no, because from the left hand side he could be wearing an all blue jumper because that side is all blue, but from the right hand side it is not all blue. So can we say that these two statements are a contradiction? Well, the answer is no, because they are coming in from a different direction or a different avenue, so they are both correct in and of themselves, meaning both statements are correct with respect to their viewpoint, as they're not coming from the same direction as in the previous case, i.e. front on. So the contradiction could only happen if they were both viewing that person from front on. But as for if they view the person from different directions, then we say both of their statements are correct in and of themselves with respect to that particular direction of viewing. So likewise here, we have a scientific explanation and we have an explanation from the unseen. There's no contradiction here because the directions are different. Yes, if we had an explanation for the heat in the summer, and this was a scientific explanation, then about 200 years later another scientific explanation comes along and makes the older one obsolete, then here we can have a contradiction because both of these explanations cannot be correct. Rather, it is likely that the newer and better scientific explanation is the correct one, and the older one is now obsolete. So here we can have a contradiction because the two ideas are coming in from the same direction, or from the same avenue if you like. But as for if you have two explanations from different avenues, then we can accept both of them, and this is what the Muslim does. He accepts both explanations. The scientific one, we can explain how it happens, and as for the unseen explanation, we simply believe in it, but we cannot explain how it happens, we haven't seen it. That's why, of course, it is unseen. But the Muslim accepts both explanations. Similar with the eclipse. The eclipse is caused because Allah Jalla wa Ala wants to show people a manifest sign. But we also have a scientific explanation as to how the eclipse is caused. So which one is correct then? Well, they're both correct. And there is no contradiction simply because they come in from different avenues, so they cannot clash with each other. You can only clash if you come in from the same avenue, just like that one-way street. Hadith 311, the statement of Jabir radiallahu anhu, he says that the Prophet used to pray the Salat al-Dhuhr when the sun would decline. So from this we learn that the general rule is that Salat al-Dhuhr is prayed immediately when the time begins, when the sun declines. Another narration from Anas ibn Malik, he says that we used to pray with the Prophet in extreme heat, such that one of us could not even put his forehead on the ground, and so he would lay a piece of cloth down on the ground and make sajda on that. So in this narration of Anas, they are praying in extreme heat, and this is permissible. So it is not haram to pray in extreme heat, you can still do that. But of course we know the recommendation from the other hadith to delay the dhuhr until it cools down. But here we find they are praying in extreme heat, they can't even put their forehead on the ground because the ground is just so hot, so they put a cloth on the ground. Well, this is permissible. It's permissible to lay down some sort of mat or a piece of clothing, so you could pray on that, even make sajda on that. Of course, if there is a need to do so, you can specify the place of sajda by putting just a cloth there. Normally this should not be done because you're imitating the Shia. They're the ones who put down a piece of cloth or some small item on the ground to make sajda on that. Otherwise, generally speaking, you are allowed to pray on a mat. And when it comes to putting down the clothing on the ground, then if the clothing is attached to you, so it's part of your attire,
is permissible, and some have said it is makruh, because the skin, they say, must touch the ground. But this opinion would create problems with socks and trousers, because then are we to say to the people to take your socks off, and likewise raise your trousers so that the skin of the knee touches the ground? This is all unnecessary. So the better opinion is that it is not makruh.
For you to make the sajda on your hands would be haram because your hand needs to be on the floor and your forehead needs to be on the floor. But if you put your forehead on your hand, then it's like you're cheating, and this would be haram. As for if you put an item of clothing which is not attached to you, so it is not part of your attire, and you put that on the ground, let's say you take off your coat and you put it on the ground to pray on it, this is perfectly permissible. This is just like praying on a mat or a sajjada. Hadith 312, from Anas, he says, we used to pray the Asr when the sun was high and alive, and a man could go to the ends of Al-Madinah and reach his family whilst the sun was still high. We learn from this narration that Salat al-Asr had to be prayed then at the early time, not the later time. Because if you pray Salat al-Asr whilst the sun is high and alive, meaning it is still very bright, it means that you're still quite early on in the afternoon. And if you go back to the ends of Al-Madinah and the sun is still high, then it means you must have prayed at the early time, because otherwise if you go back to the end of Al-Madinah, meaning the outskirts, the sun is likely to be quite low. And in another narration, some companions of Anas ibn Malik, they came to his house. Anas asked them, have you prayed the Asr? They said no. And so they got up and prayed the Asr. And afterwards Anas ibn Malik said that he heard the Prophet say, تِلْكَ صَلَاةُ الْمُنَافِقِ, this is the prayer of the munafiq. يَجْلِسُ يَرْقُبُ الشَّمْسَ حَتَّى إِذَا كَانَتْ بَيْنَ قَرْنَيِ الشَّيْطَانِ قَامَ فَنَقَرَهَا أَرْبَعًا لَا يَذْكُرُ اللَّهَ فِيهَا إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. So this munafiq, he sits and waits for the sun, then when it is setting, so it is between the two horns of the devil, the munafiq gets up and he just pecks 4 times, meaning the sajda which he makes, and indeed the whole rak'ah, it is just like pecking on the ground, very, very quickly. لا يذكر الله فيها إلا قليلا. He only remembers Allah very little. And this makes sense because getting up for the prayer is an extremely heavy duty for the munafiq. He is not eager to please Allah Jalla wa'ala. In another narration of the chapter, Rafi' ibn Khadij says, we used to pray the Asr, then we would sacrifice some camels, and we would divide it up into 10 parts, and we would cook them, and we would eat them, all before the sun set. So this shows us that the Asr must be prayed at the early time, because there's no way you could pray the Asr at the later time and do all of that before sunset. And this also favors the opinion of the majority of the scholars who say that the Asr begins when the shadow of a man is the same length as his height. And it is not likely to be the Hanafi opinion, which says that Asr begins when the shadow of a man is twice his height length.
As for this idea of the sun setting between the horns of shaitan, and likewise rising between the horns of shaitan, then this is because the sun worshippers are worshipping the sun at that time, meaning at sunrise, and likewise at sunset. And of course, this is what pleases shaitan. It has also been said that during these times the shaitan would come up near the sun, so as the sun sets, or indeed rises, then it would appear to be rising between the horns of shaitan. So the sun being in the background, and the shaitan being in the foreground, if you imagine it like a picture. So what would happen is that the prostration of the kuffar during these times would actually be a prostration to the shaitan. And this was suggested by Al-Khattabi, and Allah knows best.
Hadith 313 from Ibn Umar, the Prophet said, الذي تفوته صلاة العصر كأنما وتر أهله وماله. The one who misses Salat al-Asr, then it is as if he has lost his family and his wealth. In the narration in Sahih al-Bukhari, the Prophet ﷺ similarly said that the one who misses Salat al-Asr, then all his actions become null and void. And some would even use that hadith to say that your fasting breaks if you miss Salat al-Asr, because if your actions become null and void, and your fasting is part of your actions of course, then it means that this fasting of yours becomes null and void, meaning it breaks. So that is an opinion, but in any case, the narration here in the chapter tells us the importance of Salat al-Asr. You miss Salat al-Asr, it's as if you have lost your family and your wealth. Just imagine living your life having lost your family and your wealth. Clearly this would not be a very good life. So this hadith pertains to the one who misses Salat al-Asr intentionally. They differed, does it mean up until the sun sets or when the sun becomes yellow? Because remember, Salat al-Asr has 2 times. The time within which you have the right to delay, that's up until the sun becomes yellow. And then the time of necessity, that's from the sun becoming yellow till sunset. In any case, we say that as long as there's no necessity, you must pray before the sun becomes yellow. And then we have the difference of opinion. Does the same ruling about you losing your wealth and your family apply to all other prayers if you miss them deliberately? Or is this ruling specific to the Salat al-Asr? Well, it appears that Salat al-Asr has a particular reason for which this ruling should be given, and it is that the Salat al-Asr is right in the middle of the day. It is the middle prayer, and it usually comes at a time when people are busy with their work, and so the temptation is simply to say, look, let me finish my work, and then afterwards I'll pray the Salat al-Asr. And with this type of attitude, you could easily miss the Salat al-Asr. So this is why there is a need for the Prophet to say that the one who misses the Salat al-Asr, it is as if he has lost his family and his wealth. Otherwise, there is no doubt that missing any prayer deliberately is a major sin. But we are reminded of the necessity of not missing Salat al-Asr because it is one of the easiest prayers to miss. The other prayers normally come at a time in which you can still pray, and it is not too inconvenient, but Salat al-Asr comes at a tricky time during the day, which is the easiest prayer of all to miss. Hadith 314 from Ali, he says, when it was the day of Ahzab, which is the battle of the trench, the Prophet ﷺ said, ملأ الله قبورهم وبيوتهم نارا كما حبسونا وشغلونا عن الصلاة الوسطى حتى غابت الشمس. May Allah fill their graves and their homes with fire, as they kept us back and kept us busy from the middle prayer up until sunset. So from this hadith we find it is permissible to make dua against the mushrikeen and kuffar in general, and this is where they deserve dua against them, because here they fought the Muslims and they kept them back from the Salat al-Asr. So clearly the Prophet was very annoyed at this, and he made dua that their graves be filled with fire. This is of course in the Barzakh period, and their homes be filled with the fire. So when your home gets caught on fire, it is destroyed. So may these types of inconveniences and destruction befall them. He says they kept us back from the Salat al-Wusta. You could translate this to middle prayer, but Wusta could also mean Fudla, or the best prayer. So the Salat al-Wusta is the best prayer. And of course he's referring to Salat al-Asr here because he says up until the sun disappeared. And the prayer before the sun disappears obviously is Salat al-Asr. And the reason why Salat al-Asr is the best prayer is, as we said before in the previous hadith, it is a difficult prayer because it comes at this tricky time. So it comes at the most testing time. Now if the test is greater, then the reward would have to be greater, obviously. So when Allah Jalla wa Ala says in the Quran, وَحَافِظُوا عَلَى الصَّلَوَاتِ وَالصَّلَاةِ الْوُسْطَى وَقُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ, preserve your prayers and the Salat al-Wusta and stand in obedience before Allah. Then the Salat al-Wusta, the middle prayer or the best prayer, if we translate it like this, is referring to the Salat al-Asr. And it would be the middle prayer because the two prayers before it come during the daylight and the two after it come during the nighttime hours. We learn from another narration in the same chapter that the Prophet settled down in Budhan and he made wudu, and the companions made wudu as well, and this was obviously after the sunset. And the Prophet started by praying the Salat al-Asr, then he prayed the Salat al-Maghrib. So we learn from this that when you are praying or making up for the missed prayers, it must be done in order. Otherwise we know that this is the time for Salat al-Maghrib. But the order of the prayer is important. So if for example you've missed your Salat al-Maghrib and you come to the masjid and they are praying the Salat al-Isha, you can join in with the Imam, but your intention must be of Salat al-Maghrib. And this is permissible for you. The scholars say that you're excused if you did not pray in order out of forgetfulness or ignorance. So this is a lightening of the load. But if you deliberately pray it out of order, then you have to repeat the prayers and do them in order. But one could ask a question here. Why could the Prophet and the companions not have prayed the Salat al-Khawf, the fair prayer? Because this battle of Khandaq took place in the 5th year, and Salat al-Khawf was legislated at that time. Well, the answer given is that if the fear is such that you cannot even perform the Salat al-Khawf, so you're right in the middle of the battle, then you are allowed to pray outside its time. But this would be in an extreme case where you simply cannot stop for prayer. Maybe you're right in the middle of the battle. Hadith 315 from Abu Huraira, the Prophet said, يَتَعَاقَبُونَ فِيكُمْ مَلَائِكَةٌ بِاللَّيْلِ وَمَلَائِكَةٌ بِالنَّهَارِ وَيَجْتَمِعُونَ فِي صَلَاةِ الْفَجْرِ وَصَلَاةِ الْعَصْرِ ثُمَّ يَعْرُجُ الَّذِينَ بَاتُوا فِيكُمْ فيسألهم ربهم وهو أعلم بهم كيف تركتم عبادي فيقولون تركناهم وهم يصلون وأتيناهم وهم يصلون. He said that the angels of the night and the angels of the day, they follow each other in a cycle. So some angels come to you by daytime and then they go up, and then the angels of nighttime come to you in this cycle. And he says that these two groups of angels, though, they meet up at Salat al-Fajr and Salat al-Asr time. And then the angels who spent the night with you, they go up to their Lord, and their Lord asks them, even though he knows better, how did you leave my servants? And the angels will say, we left them whilst they were praying, and we came to them whilst they were praying. So from this hadith we learn about the virtue of Salat al-Fajr and Salat al-Asr. These are the two bardain, the two cold prayers, as the Prophet said, Man salla al-bardain dakhla al-Jannah, whoever prays the two cold prayers will enter Jannah. So at Salat al-Fajr and Salat al-Asr, it becomes cool. So we find that if you are praying the Salat al-Fajr and the Salat al-Asr in Jama'ah, then the Malaika will testify for you. They will say that we came to them and they were praying, we left them and they were praying. So it makes out as if all the time you are praying. And clearly this is a good report given to Allah Jalla wa Ala. Hadith 316 from Salma ibn al-Akwa. He says that the Prophet used to pray Salat al-Maghrib when the sun would set, meaning the whole disk goes below the horizon. And so this hadith is clear enough that you pray the Salat al-Maghrib immediately when the sun disappears and you don't delay. But let's join this onto the other narration in the next chapter about the Salat al-Isha. From Abdullah ibn Umar, he says that the Prophet delayed the Salat al-Isha up until a third of the night had passed, and he says we don't know what was keeping him back, maybe his family, maybe something else. But then he came out and he said, إِنَّكُمْ لَتَنْتَظِرُونَ صَلَاةً مَا يَنْتَظِرُهَا أَهْلُ دِينٍ غَيْرُكُمْ وَلَوْلَا أَنْ يَثْقُلَ عَلَى أُمَّتِي لَصَلَّيْتُ بِهِمْ هَذِهِ السَّاعَةِ. He says, you have been waiting for a prayer which no one else has been waiting for. And if it wasn't for the fact that it would be difficult upon my ummah, I would pray this prayer at this time. And then afterwards he ordered the mu'adhin to give the iqamah. We find from this narration that with the Salat al-Isha it is better to delay it, and it is not the usual rule where you pray at the early time. We also find from this deen that there is no hardship in the acts of worship, so this is why the Prophet would pray the Salat al-Isha earlier, normally. The Prophet ﷺ would look at the people. If they were ready to pray early, he would pray early with them, but if they wanted to pray later, he would pray later with them. So with the Salat al-Isha it is much more flexible. In some narrations it says that the companions were waiting for the prayer and their heads were nodding out of slumber. Now does this mean that the sleep does not break the prayer because they got up and started to pray without renewing the wudu? Well, we say this, that mere slumber does not break the prayer. Rather, if you go in a state in which if you were to break the wudu you would not notice it, then that state does break the prayer. So the key is when you lose consciousness, either through sleep or through being knocked out. In another narration it says that half the night has passed when the Prophet came out, or close to half the night. So it would have been something like between a third and a half of the night. Of course the time finishes when half of the night passes. And also it mentions that the Prophet came out, he was wearing a ring, and this idea of wearing the ring, it is not a sunnah of ibadah, a worship action, which is also sunnah. Rather, this is just something which is customary, so we say it is sunnah for you to wear it if you need to wear it, because the Prophet only took this ring when he needed to. So it is permissible to wear it, but it is not an act of worship. So it's not the same type of sunnah as, for example, using the miswak
before the Salah. Okay, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. We have covered at least 3 variations of the Dua al-Istiftah. Recall them. Question number 2. Give the detail which we mentioned regarding the menstruating woman making up for the Salah. Question number 3. We mentioned at least 2 pieces of evidence which tell us that Jahannam is extant today. Recall them.